Okay, so let's be honest for a second, right? Like, we are completely bombarded with financial advice constantly. Seriously, it's everywhere you turn. And honestly, it can be so overwhelming. So how do you know what to actually pay attention to? What's really going to make a difference in your financial life? And what's just kind of noise, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And amidst all of that noise, there's this idea that's gained a lot of traction recently, this concept of just keep buying. And at first glance, it seems almost too simple to be true,
Oh,
right?
really?
But the thing is, beneath that simplicity, there's a really powerful and well-supported philosophy.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving deep into for you today. One of our awesome listeners sent us this book, oceanuppdf.com, just keep buying, technically.pdf. And we're on a mission to break it down for you, to really get to the heart of what this just keep buying approach actually means for your financial life. We're not just going to summarize it. We're going to extract the most important takeaways, the stuff that you can actually use to make better financial decisions.
I think what's really interesting about this book is that the author himself, he actually starts by talking about some of his early experiences with investing. And he's super honest about it, like how he would get so caught up in analyzing his investments, obsessing over every tiny little move in the market, even though he had like a ridiculously small amount of money actually invested at the time.
Yeah, I think we've all been there at some point, right? Like
Yeah.
obsessing over pennies when you should be focusing on dollars.
Totally. It's so common. And it's easy to get caught up in the weeds trying to find the perfect stock or time the market perfectly. But especially when you're starting out, the real game changer is often something else entirely.
Exactly. And that's the realization that the author had. He basically had this aha moment where he was like, wait a minute, I'm putting all this energy into optimizing a tiny little portfolio when I should be focusing on the bigger picture, like how much I'm earning and how much I'm spending. Like, it's like trying to squeeze every last drop out of a leaky faucet when you should be fixing the leak itself, you know?
Right. It's about addressing the root cause. And that leads to a really important question, especially for those of you who are maybe earlier in your financial journey. Where should your initial focus be? Should you be hyper-focused on saving, or should you be diving headfirst into investing?
Well, that's where this really interesting concept from the book comes in, the save-invest continuum.
Yeah, I love this concept. Basically, the idea is that where you direct your financial energy towards saving or towards investing, it's not a static decision. It should change and evolve depending on where you are in your financial life. The author even puts it pretty bluntly, saying, saving is for the poor and investing is for the rich.
Oh, okay. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but it's important to understand the context here. He's not using poor and rich in a judgmental way. He's talking about it in both absolute terms, but also relative to your own financial situation and goals. Like, think about it. A recent college grad with, even a decent starting salary is in a completely different financial position compared to, say, someone who's been working for 10 years and has already built up some savings.
Right. So poor and rich are relative to your own personal financial journey.
Exactly. And for the author, it really clicked when he looked back on his own early years. He spent so much time stressing over those small investment decisions when he really should have been focusing on increasing his income as much as possible.
Okay, so how do you figure out where you fall on this continuum?
Well, the book provides a pretty simple way to think about it. It basically boils down to comparing your expected savings for the next year with the income you anticipate making from your existing investments. And he emphasizes the importance of being able to comfortably save, meaning you should be aiming for an amount that you can realistically achieve without, feeling like you're constantly depriving yourself or living on a shoestring budget.
So if you think you can realistically save a significant amount in the next year, much more than what your investments are currently generating, then the book suggests that your primary focus should probably be on maximizing that savings rate.
Right, because the more capital you can get into the game, the faster you can start building wealth through investing. And the book really drives this point home with some pretty striking data. Like, research from the Federal Reserve and the NBER shows this massive gap in savings rates across different income levels. Like, the bottom 20% of earners might only be able to save 1% of their income, while the top 20% are saving around 24%, and the top 1%, they're putting away a whopping 51% of what they earn. So this really highlights the fundamental challenge that a lot of people face, just getting to the point where they can actually invest a meaningful amount of money.
Those numbers are wild. So it really does seem like income level plays a huge role in determining how much you're able to save.
Totally. And it's not just a recent phenomenon either. Research from UC Berkeley has shown a pretty consistent positive correlation between savings rates and wealth accumulation over a large chunk of the 20th century. This really underscores the importance of getting your saving rate up as early as possible.
This all makes a lot of sense, but it kind of flies in the face of that whole save 20% of your income advice that we hear all the time. Like, if everyone's income and expenses are different, how can there be a magic percentage that works for everyone?
Yeah, the book really challenges those one-size-fits-all savings rules. It argues that they completely ignore the reality of income fluctuations, which a lot of people experience, and they operate under this assumption that everyone can and should save at the exact same rate. And that's just not realistic. The book uses a really great analogy here, comparing it to Dolly Hordenchar, which is this fish that adjusts how much it eats based on the food that's available. And our financial lives are kind of similar in that we need to be adaptable, trying to stick to a rigid rule. It might work for some people, but for many of us, it's just setting ourselves up for frustration and potential failure.
Okay, so if we ditch the strict percentage rules, how do we figure out how much we can realistically save? What's a more practical way to approach it?
Well, it all boils down to a pretty simple equation. Savings equals income minus spending. Seems super obvious, right? But the author points out something really important here. Calculating your income is usually straightforward. You know how much you get paid, right? But tracking your spending, that's where things get tricky.
Oh, I feel that. Every time I've tried to make a detailed budget and track every single expense, it's just been a nightmare. It feels like I'm constantly chasing receipts and trying to remember where every dollar went.
Yeah, budgeting can be a total pain for sure. And the author gets that. So he offers some alternative approaches that you might find more sustainable. Like one thing he found really helpful was to put all of his variable expenses, so things like restaurants, entertainment, clothes shopping, that kind of stuff. He put it all on a single credit card. And then, of course, he made sure to pay that card off in full every month. It might not be the most optimal strategy for maximizing rewards points or whatever, but it gave him a much clearer picture of where his discretionary spending was actually going without having to track every little thing.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about simplifying things and making it easier to manage your money without getting bogged down in the details. Now, I think something that a lot of us worry about, especially when we're trying to save, is whether we're saving enough. Like, is there even a finish line when it comes to saving?
It's a common worry, for sure. And the book actually tackles this head on by pointing out this really interesting disconnect between what people think constitutes being rich and what actual millionaires believe. Like, the average American thinks that someone with a net worth of around $2.3 million is rich. But when you ask millionaires themselves, they tend to put that number way higher, closer to $7.5 million. So for those of you listening, this might mean that you're chasing a goalpost that keeps moving further and further away. You might actually already be saving more than you really need to achieve a comfortable level of financial security.
So it's all relative, right? Your definition of enough is going to depend on your own personal goals and circumstances. Now, this next idea from the book really threw me for a loop. The possibility that we might actually need to save less than we think. That was kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's definitely counterintuitive to what we usually hear, right? But it all comes down to the research on how retirees actually spend their money. Like, the big fear is that we're all going to run out of money in retirement, but the data actually paints a different picture. Studies have shown that a significant portion of retirees, their financial assets, actually stay pretty stable or even increase over time.
Seriously, their money is growing, even though they're not working anymore.
Yeah, it seems crazy, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. In many cases, their income from sources like Social Security, pensions, and even just their existing investments, it's enough to cover their living expenses. So they're not actually needing to dig into their principal that much, if at all. This research suggests that the risk of running out of money in retirement, it's actually much lower than we often think.
So all this doom and gloom we hear about outliving our savings, maybe it's not as universal as it's made out to be.
Exactly. It really challenges that save every penny mentality. It doesn't mean that saving isn't important, but it does suggest that some of us might be able to relax a little bit, maybe reevaluate our savings goals, and consider allocating some of those resources to other things that are important to us, whether it's enjoying life a bit more now or investing in experiences or whatever.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about how much we might need to save, and this surprising idea that maybe it's less than we think. But the book takes it a step further by calling out what it calls the biggest lie in personal finance. What's that all about?
Oh, this is a good one. So according to the author, the biggest lie in personal finance is this notion that you can become wealthy simply by cutting your spending drastically. Now, he's not saying that being mindful of your spending or having financial goals is bad. He's just arguing that the real drivers for those who achieve significant wealth, it's usually a combination of high income and often very low spending, sometimes to an extreme. For most of us, simply cutting back on lattes and avocado toast, it's not going to be enough to make us millionaires.
So the live like a pauper, become a prince mentality, it's not the whole story.
Not even close. And he uses some really powerful examples to illustrate this. Like, he contrasts these extreme scenarios, right? You have someone who manages to retire incredibly early by living a ridiculously frugal lifestyle, maybe in a super low-cost area, and then you have someone who pulls in a huge income for, say, 10 years, like an investment banker or a high-level executive. These scenarios are not about clipping coupons and skipping vacations, you know? They require fundamental shifts in either your lifestyle or your earning power, or both. And for a lot of people, the biggest issue isn't that they're overspending on frivolous stuff, it's that they simply don't earn enough to begin with.
That's a really good point. And the book backs this up with some hard data too, right?
Absolutely. Like, there's data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey showing that the bottom 20% of income earners, they often spend more than their entire take-home pay just on basic necessities, things like food, housing, healthcare, transportation. There's literally no wiggle room there to cut back enough to build wealth, you know?
So it's like this vicious cycle where you're stuck just trying to make ends meet and there's no opportunity to get ahead.
Exactly. And even when lower income households do get a raise, those gains are often completely eaten up by the rising costs of those same essential goods and services. Whereas higher income households, they have a much easier time saving and investing because those necessary expenses make up a much smaller percentage of their overall income.
Right, so it's almost like this system is rigged against those who are already struggling.
In a way, yeah. And the book really calls out the financial media for perpetuating this myth that we can all become wealthy by just cutting back on small expenses. They love to focus on these tiny, insignificant things like that daily latte or your Netflix subscription, but the math just doesn't add up. To turn those small savings into real wealth, you'd need to achieve these unrealistic investment returns over a very long time.
I mean, consistently earning 12% annual returns year after year, which is basically impossible to do reliably.
Exactly. And not only that, the book critiques how this type of advice can be really condescending, you know?
Yeah.
Like telling people to make their own dish soap or reuse dental floss as if that's the key to financial freedom. While there's nothing wrong with being frugal, it's missing the point. For many people, the problem isn't their spending habits, it's a lack of income in the first place.
So it's like blaming the victim instead of addressing the root cause of the problem.
Totally. And the book even references research from Bangladesh and Kenya, where they did these studies involving wealth and direct cash transfers. And what they found was that a lack of capital can trap people in low-paying jobs, regardless of their talent or motivation. It's like this poverty trap where you simply don't have the resources to invest in yourself or your future, so you're stuck in this cycle of low-paying work.
That's really disheartening. But it does make you think. If simply cutting back on spending has these inherent limitations, what's the alternative? Where should we be focusing our energy if we want to improve our financial situation?
The logical answer is that we need to focus on increasing our income. And the book actually outlines a few different strategies for doing that, at least temporarily. Like, the first one is pretty straightforward. Sell more of your time. This could be taking on a side hustle, doing some freelance work, whatever you can do to generate some extra cash flow. It's relatively easy to get started, but it's obviously limited by how many hours you have in a day.
Yeah, there are only so many hours you can work.
Right. So then there's the option of selling a skill or a service. This could be anything from photography to graphic design to writing, consulting, whatever you're good at. This has the potential to earn you a higher rate than just general labor, and it can help you build a personal brand. But it still relies on your direct involvement, so it doesn't really scale that well.
And then there's the online world. There are tons of opportunities to teach people online, create courses, build an audience.
Exactly. And this is where you can start to see some real scalability, like creating self-paced courses or digital products. It can generate income passively even while you sleep. But the book also makes the point that live, interactive courses and workshops, they tend to command higher prices than just self-study materials.
So there are trade-offs with each approach. But it's good to know that there are options out there, even if you're not starting out with a ton of capital.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the traditional 9 to 5 job is still a very valid path to building wealth. The book even references The Millionaire Next Door and how a lot of those self-made millionaires, they built their wealth through steady careers, saving and investing consistently over time.
So it's not necessarily about becoming an entrepreneur or an influencer, right? You can still build wealth through traditional means.
Totally. But the key takeaway here is that these different strategies, they should be viewed as temporary steps, ways to generate extra capital that you can then use to acquire income-producing assets. That's where you can really start to see your wealth grow exponentially.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the book talks a lot about this concept of thinking like an owner. What does it actually mean in practice?
Well, the book uses a really great example here. Jerry Richardson. He's the only guy who's played in the NFL and also become a billionaire. And his wealth, it didn't come solely from his playing salary, which was obviously substantial, but it was primarily built through his business ventures. He started by investing in Hardee's franchises, and then he went on to buy the Carolina Panthers. So for those of you listening, this shows the power of moving beyond just being an employee and becoming an owner.
So it's not just about working for someone else and getting a raise. It's about having ownership stakes in something that can generate income over time, even when you're not actively working.
Exactly. It's about shifting from trading your time for money to owning assets that can generate income passively, whether it's a business, real estate, or investments.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of focusing on income, but the book also spends a lot of time discussing spending, and it uses these two characters, James and Dennis, to illustrate the extremes of spending habits. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, James and Dennis are like polar opposites when it comes to spending. James is the ultimate guilt-free spender. He buys whatever he wants, whenever he wants, without thinking too much about the long-term consequences. Dennis, on the other hand, is the extreme saver. He's so frugal that it almost borders on anxiety. Like the book tells the story about him trying to avoid surge pricing on Uber on New Year's Eve, and it ends up backfiring spectacularly.
Oh yeah, the Uber pin trick.
Exactly. It's a funny story, but it also highlights how taking frugality to an extreme can actually be detrimental to your well-being.
So neither extreme is ideal, right?
Yeah.
One leads to financial instability, and the other can lead to a life that feels unnecessarily restricted.
Exactly. So the book advocates for finding a middle ground, a way to enjoy your money without jeopardizing your long-term goals. And it offers 2 specific tips to help you do that.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The first tip is the 2x rule. The basic idea is that for every non-essential purchase you make, you also invest the same amount of money. So if you buy a new pair of shoes for, say, $100, you also invest $100 in the stock market or whatever your preferred investment vehicle is. It forces you to think twice about those impulse buys,
That's a pretty clever way to make yourself think twice before spending.
Right. And then the second tip is to focus on maximizing fulfillment. And this is about making a distinction between fleeting happiness and genuine fulfillment. The book uses the example of running a marathon, right? Training for and running a marathon, it's not always going to be fun in the moment, but it can lead to this deep sense of accomplishment and fulfillment.
So it's about being more intentional with your spending and focusing on experiences and purchases that align with your values and bring you lasting satisfaction rather than just momentary pleasure.
Exactly. And there's actually research from the University of Cambridge that shows a link between making purchases that fit your psychological profile and experiencing higher life satisfaction. So it's not just about the money, it's about how you spend it.
Okay, so we've talked about spending, but there's another topic that can be a bit controversial: lifestyle creep. What's the book's take on that?
It actually takes a more nuanced view than you might expect. It acknowledges that enjoying the rewards of your hard work is important. It's not about depriving yourself constantly, but it also cautions against letting your spending increase too rapidly as your income grows. It suggests this general guideline of trying to limit spending increases to around 50% of any future raises you get. This way, you can enjoy some of that extra income while still ensuring that you're saving and investing enough for the future.
So it's about finding that balance between enjoying the present and planning for the future.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to a topic that often triggers a lot of strong opinions: debt. And the book, it actually presents a bit of a controversial perspective here. It challenges this conventional wisdom that all debt is bad.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too. We're always told to avoid debt at all costs, right?
Right. But the book makes a really good point. Debt itself isn't inherently good or bad. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or for evil, depending on how you use it.
Okay, so how does the book reframe our thinking about debt?
It uses this really interesting analogy, comparing it to desert annual plants, where some of their seeds stay dormant each year, even if the conditions are perfect for them to grow. And this is actually a survival mechanism. It ensures that the species can survive across different environmental conditions. So the point is, sometimes what seems like a negative trait can actually be beneficial in certain circumstances.
So just because something has a negative connotation doesn't mean it's always bad.
Exactly. And the book gives this really thought-provoking example of a woman named Seema in a developing country. She actually used small, short-term loans as a form of forced savings. So even though she was paying interest on those loans, it provided her with the structure and discipline to save money that she might not have been able to do otherwise.
That's really interesting. It's like turning debt on its head and using it as a tool for building savings.
Exactly. And that's the point the book is trying to make. Debt is not inherently good or bad, it's how you use it. And when used responsibly, debt can actually be really helpful. Like, it can reduce uncertainty. Think about a fixed rate mortgage, right? You have a predictable housing payment for the next 15 or 30 years. And debt can also be used to generate returns that are higher than the cost of borrowing, like with investments in education or a well-planned business loan.
So it's all about being strategic and understanding how debt works.
Exactly. The book even provides a simplified way to think about the financial return on investing in your education. It encourages you to consider the increase in your lifetime earnings compared to what you would have earned if you hadn't gone to school.
That's a really cool way to think about it. But of course, the book also acknowledges that debt does come with risks, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like, debt can definitely have negative impacts on your mental and physical health, especially if you're feeling stressed about it.
Hmm.
And a key point the book emphasizes is that having the ability to choose when you take on debt, that's a huge factor in whether it ends up being beneficial or not.
Right. So it's about being in control of your debt, not letting it control you. Now, speaking of debt, let's talk about a decision that almost everyone faces at some point. Renting versus buying a home. What's the book's take on that age-old debate?
It starts by outlining all the upfront costs that come with buying a home. You have the down payment, which can be anywhere from 3.5% to 20% of the purchase price. And then you have closing costs, which can add another 2% to 5% on top of that. It's a lot of money to come up with.
Yeah, buying a home's not cheap, that's for sure.
Definitely not. And then you have the ongoing costs, too. There's property taxes, homeowners insurance, and potentially private mortgage insurance if you put down less than 20%. And then there's the cost of maintenance and repairs, which a lot of people underestimate.
Yeah, those unexpected expenses can really add up.
They totally can. And the book does a really interesting analysis comparing renting versus buying, using the author's grandparents as an example. They bought a home in California back in the 1970s, and obviously real estate in California has appreciated like crazy since then. But the book shows that if they had invested the money they put into their home into the S&P 500 instead, they would have likely ended up with significantly more wealth.
Wow, that's a pretty compelling argument in favor of renting. But I guess it also depends on where you live and what the real estate market is like in your area.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And the book acknowledges that there are valid reasons why people might choose to buy a home, even if it's not the most financially optimal choice. Like, there's the emotional aspect of owning your own place, the stability of having a fixed housing payment, and of course the potential for building equity over time.
So it's a personal decision that should be based on your own circumstances and goals.
Exactly. And if you do decide to buy a home, the book really stresses the importance of being able to comfortably afford it. It emphasizes the importance of the debt-to-income ratio, suggesting that ideally it should be below 43%. And it also suggests that even if you don't put down a 20% down payment, you should at least be able to, as a measure of your financial readiness.
So it's about being prepared and making sure you're not stretching yourself too thin financially. Now, let's say you're saving up for a big purchase, like a down payment on a house. Should you keep that money in cash or invest it? What's the book's advice?
Well, it really depends on your time horizon. For short-term goals, like anything less than 3 years away, the general consensus is that cash is the safest bet.
So play it safe if you need the money soon.
Exactly. But for goals that are further out, like 5 years or more, inflation starts to become a bigger factor. And in those cases, the book suggests considering investing in something like bonds, which historically have provided returns that at least partially offset inflation.
So if you have time on your side, you can afford to take on a little more risk.
Exactly. And generally speaking, the book advises against investing in the stock market for those short-term savings goals, simply because of the volatility. You don't want to risk losing money right when you need it.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about retirement. How do you know when you're ready to retire?
Well, the book makes the point that retirement readiness, it's not just about the numbers. It's a big life decision that involves a lot of different factors, like how you want to spend your time, where you want to live, and what's going to give you a sense of purpose and fulfillment in retirement.
Right, it's not just about having enough money. It's about having a plan for how you're going to spend your time and energy.
Exactly. But of course, the financial aspect is a big part of it. And the book introduces this concept called the 4% rule, which was developed by a financial planner named William Bengen. His research suggests that retirees can safely withdraw around 4% of their initial retirement portfolio each year, adjusted for inflation, from a balanced portfolio of stocks and bonds, and have a very high probability of that money lasting for at least 30 years.
Okay, so that gives us a rough guideline for how much we might need to have saved.
Right, and the book provides a simplified formula for calculating your total retirement savings goal. It's basically 25 times your annual excess spending, which is your total anticipated annual spending in retirement minus any guaranteed income you expect to receive from things like Social Security or a pension.
So that's a good starting point for figuring out how much you need. But it's also worth noting that the 4% rule, it has its critics, right?
Yeah, it definitely does. Some people argue that in today's environment with low interest rates and bond yields, that 4% withdrawal rate might be a bit too optimistic.
So it's always good to err on the side of caution and maybe save a bit more than you think you'll need.
Agreed. Now, the book also talks about how spending habits tend to change in retirement. Like research from JP Morgan has shown that for many retirees, their spending actually goes down in retirement.
Really? I would have thought it'd go up with all that free time to travel and pursue hobbies.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But it seems like for a lot of people, their expenses actually decrease, especially as they get older. So that's something to keep in mind when you're projecting your retirement needs. You might not need to save quite as much as you initially think.
That's good to know. Now, the book also introduces another perspective on retirement readiness, the crossover point rule. What's that all about?
The crossover point rule basically says that you're financially independent or ready to retire when the income you generate from your investments exceeds your monthly expenses. So you're no longer relying on a paycheck to cover your living costs.
That makes sense. And the book provides a formula for calculating the crossover assets you need to reach that point.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You take your monthly expenses and divide it by your expected monthly investment return. But the book really emphasizes that retirement is more than just a financial calculation. It's a big life decision, and you need to think about how you're going to spend your time, how you're going to stay socially connected, and what's going to give you a sense of purpose in retirement.
Right. It's about having a fulfilling life, not just a financially secure one. Now let's talk about investing itself. Why is it so important to invest in the first place?
Well, the book lays out 3 key reasons why investing is so crucial, especially in today's world. First of all, it's about saving for your future self. Research has shown that people who explicitly save for retirement, they tend to be much more successful savers.
So it's about having that long-term vision and prioritizing your future financial well-being.
Exactly. And the second reason is inflation. We all know that prices tend to go up over time, right? That's inflation. And if you're not investing, your money is essentially losing value every year.
Right. So even if you're saving money, it's not going to be worth as much in the future if you're not investing it and earning a return that at least keeps pace with inflation.
Exactly. And the third reason to invest is to replace your human capital with financial capital. What that means is, as you get older, your ability to earn income through your work, that's going to decline eventually. So investing is a way to convert that finite human capital into a lasting source of income that can support you in retirement.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we understand why we should invest, but the question that a lot of people have is what should they actually invest in?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And the book starts this section with a really important point. It uses an analogy from the world of martial arts, talking about this legendary judo instructor named Wally J. And Wally J emphasized that there's no single true path to mastery. Each student needs individualized instruction. And it's the same with investing, There's no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another.
So be wary of anyone who claims to have the secret. to investing success.
Totally. And the book then goes on to discuss several different asset classes that you might consider investing in. Let's start with bonds.
Okay, what's the deal with bonds?
So bonds are basically loans that you make to a government or a company. And in return for lending them money, they agree to pay you interest over a set period of time and then return your principal when the bond matures. U.S. Treasury bonds, they're generally considered to be one of the safest investments because they're backed by the U.S. government, but they also tend to have lower returns than other types of bonds.
So lower risk, lower return.
Right. And then there are other types of bonds, like corporate bonds and municipal bonds, which can offer higher returns, but they also come with more risk.
So it's all about finding that balance between risk and return. What about real estate? That's an asset class that a lot of people are interested in.
Yeah, real estate can be a great investment, especially over the long term, but it also comes with its own set of challenges. Like, it's not as liquid as stocks or bonds, so it can be harder to sell quickly if you need cash. And there's also the hassle of managing properties, dealing with tenants, and making repairs.
Yeah, being a landlord is not for everyone.
Right, so if you're interested in real estate but don't want to deal with all the headaches of owning physical property, you might consider investing in REITs, or real estate investment trusts. They're basically companies that own and manage real estate, and you can buy shares in them just like you would with any other stock.
So it's a way to get exposure to the real estate market without all the hassle.
Exactly. And the book also touches on some less conventional asset classes, like farmland.
Farmland. Is that really an investment?
Yeah, it's actually becoming more and more popular. The idea is that farmland is a finite resource, and the world population is growing, so the demand for food is only going to increase. And farmland also tends